morning, church. At a recent SPRC meeting, the pastor was looking at his upcoming schedule. Knowing that he would be unavailable the first 2 weeks in July, he asked us if we preferred to bring in outside speakers or have church members deliver the message. I responded that it didn't really matter, that variety was the spice of life. I didn't anticipate just how spicy that comment would be until 2 weeks later when the pastor asked me to fill in today. So here we are. In the past, when asked to fill in, I looked to the church lectionary or liturgical calendar for any historical event that could be celebrated at this time. Unfortunately, there's nothing on the calendar between Pentecost and Advent. Being reluctant to start from scratch, I looked at former messages and found one from 16 years ago that is pretty much timeless. When speaking about summer programming for Wheel of Fortune, Pat Sajak said to not think of these shows as reruns, but rather as encore performances. With that in mind, today I bring you an encore performance of a mystery, and who doesn't like a good whodunit? The title of this mystery is, Who Wrote the Books of Moses? At first, this might look like a trick question, like who's buried in Grant's tomb? Of course, the answer to that one is Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia Dent Grant. But the question as to who wrote the books of Moses is actually one of the oldest puzzles in the world. What we are talking about are the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books are also known as the Book of Laws, the Pentateuch, from Greek meaning 5 scrolls, or the Torah, which is Hebrew for instruction. The tradition is that these were written by Moses, but nowhere in the text does it say that he was the author. In fact, challenges to his authorship go back 900 years. In the 11th century, a Jewish court physician in Spain by the name of Isaac ibn Yashush first raised the issue. He pointed out that a list of Edomite kings that appears in Genesis 36 included kings who lived long after Moses was dead. Yashush suggested that the list was written by someone who lived after Moses. The response to his conclusion was that he was labeled Isaac the Blunderer. But this was only the beginning. In the 14th century in Damascus, the Rabbi Joseph Bonfils picked up the same issue and wrote, and this is evidence that this verse was written in the Torah later, and Moses did not write it, but rather one of the later prophets wrote it. But the challenges were not limited to those within the Jewish faith. In the 15th century, Alphonsus Dotatus, Bishop of Avila, stated that certain passages, notably the account of Moses' death, could not have been written by Moses. It was suggested that Moses' successor Joshua wrote this account. Some investigators suggested that Moses wrote the 5 books, but that editors went over them later. In the 16th century, Andreas van Maes, who was a Flemish Catholic, suggested that a later editor inserted phrases or changed the name of a place to its more current name so that readers would understand it better. As a result, Van Maes' book was placed on the Catholic Index of Prohibited Books. By the 17th century, some were suggesting that Moses did not write the majority of the Pentateuch. The British philosopher Thomas Hobbes collected numerous cases of facts and statements through the course of the 5 books that were inconsistent with Mosaic authorship. Eventually, it got to the point where some were suggesting that Moses did not write any of the 5 books. The first to say so explicitly was a French Calvinist by the name of Isaac de la Pierre. His book was banned and burned. He was arrested and informed that in order to be released, he would have to become Catholic and recant his views to the Pope, which he did. Of course, the challenges did not stop there, and today the challenge to Moses' authorship even has a name: the documentary hypothesis. Its proponents are linguists and scholars who have studied early documents written in Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew. They base their assertion that Moses did not write the Pentateuch on this evidence. First, anachronisms, that is, the descriptions of people and events that were not appropriate to the time of Moses. Second, point of view, that is, writing as an observer instead of the speaker. Moses did this instead of I did this. Third, style, that is, differences in writing style within the books. And finally, doublets, stories that are described twice in the Bible. Not only do the proponents challenge Moses as the author, but they offer us alternative writers, not by actual names, but by code names. The first is J, who refers to God as Yahweh and focuses on Judah. The second is E, who refers to God as Elohim and focuses on biblical Israel. The third is P, who is interested in the priesthood of Aaron and focuses on laws, lists, and dates. And finally, we have D, who is interested in the Shiloh priesthood and focuses almost entirely on the addresses delivered by Moses to the people, most of it in Deuteronomy. And these writers apparently wrote at different times. J at about 950 BC, E at about 750 BC, P at about 450 BC, and D at about 625 BC. Now, this is the simple version. There are those who suggest that there were really two or more J's, J1, J2, and maybe J3, and there were most certainly two D's, D1 and D2. It's beginning to sound like the children's show, Bananas in Pajamas, B1 and B2. So the authorship of the 5 books is an intriguing issue, but the question for us is, does it really matter? As Christians, I believe that it does matter. Our faith says that the Bible was written by men, but under divine inspiration. We know who Moses was, and Isaiah, and Malachi, and Matthew, and Paul, and John, and we believe that their writing was inspired by God. We don't know who J was, or P, or D1, or D2. We don't know whether or not they were divinely inspired. And while it doesn't say explicitly in the Bible that Moses was the author of the 5 books, the NIV Study Bible does offer some insight. The Bible itself suggests Mosaic authorship. However, a certain amount of later editorial updating does appear to be indicated. And the NIV also refers to the documentary hypothesis when it says, during the last 3 centuries, many scholars have claimed to find in the Pentateuch 4 underlying sources. Each of these documents is claimed to have its own characteristics and its own theology, which often contradicts that of the other documents. The Pentateuch is thus depicted as a patchwork of stories, poems, and laws. However, this view is not supported by conclusive evidence, and intensive archaeological and literary research has tended to undercut many of the arguments used to challenge Mosaic authorship. Now, faced with 2 dissenting views, what are we to believe? Not surprisingly, I tend to support the position of the NIV. Now, Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew are all Greek to me, and I'm certainly no biblical scholar, but I'll try to address the evidence cited in the documentary hypothesis. First, we ought to determine if Moses was, in fact, a writer. We learn in Exodus that Moses was born in February or March 1391 BC, at a time when the Egyptian Pharaoh had commanded that all male Hebrew children born be killed by drowning in the river Nile. Jochebed, the wife of the Levite Amram, bore a son and kept him concealed for 3 months. When she could keep him hidden no longer, rather than deliver him to be killed, she set him adrift on the Nile River in a small craft of bulrushes coated in pitch. In the biblical account, Moses' sister Miriam observed the progress of the tiny boat until it reached a place where the Pharaoh's daughter Bithia was bathing with her handmaidens. It is said that she spotted the baby in the basket and had her handmaiden fetch it for her. Miriam then came forward and asked the Pharaoh's daughter if she would like a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. Thereafter, Moses' real mother, Jochebed, was employed as the child's nurse. When he grew older, he was brought back to the Pharaoh's daughter and became her son and a younger brother to Ramses II, the future Pharaoh of Egypt. Since he was adopted into the Egyptian royal family, it is only natural to expect that he would be educated and taught to read and write. And in fact, this is reflected in the story of Moses found in Acts 7, verses 20 to 22. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So we know that Moses was educated, but did he write the 5 books? And was this writing divinely inspired? Throughout the Pentateuch, it becomes clear that Moses is recording what happens, often at the specific direction of God. In Exodus 17, verse 14, Moses is commanded by God following the defeat of the Amalekites at Rephidim. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." We are also told in Exodus 34, verses 27-28, that Moses wrote down the 10 Commandments. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. In this case, we see that Moses was not just writing to the Israelites of his time. He is clearly writing for future generations. And Moses is not just writing documents. He is dictating to his people. This is significant because it has shed some light on the issue of authorship. How do you define authorship? Does an author have to produce a document on a scroll or a tablet? Let me ask you this, and it's not a trick question. Who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey? Any student of classic literature would tell you that it was Homer, a Greek poet who lived about 850 BC. He was either a traveling minstrel or a court singer who recited his epic poems. He was also blind. So he obviously didn't write down his poems. He either dictated them to a scribe or a group of scribes wrote them down as he recited them. But we still say that Homer was the author or creator of the poems. We need to keep this in mind as we examine the authorship of the books of Moses or the books of the law. The Bible repeatedly refers to Moses as the authority behind the books of the law. The books are referred to as the Book of Moses 5 times, the Law of Moses 22 times, the Book of the Law of Moses 4 times, and the Word of the Lord by Moses 1 time. Up to now, we have looked at evidence of Moses' writing that appears within the Pentateuch, but there are many other references throughout the Bible. In 1 Kings, we read that the Lord said, "I will not again make the feet of the Israelites wander from the land I gave their forefathers, if only they will be careful to do everything I commanded them, and will keep the whole law that my servant Moses gave them." Again in Malachi, the Lord admonishes, "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel." And there are more references in the New Testament. John writes in chapter 1, Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." This quote clearly indicates that the law referred to is much more than just the 10 Commandments or the log of the journey of the Israelites out of Egypt. In all, there are over 30 references to Moses' writing or Moses' law throughout the Scriptures. He is clearly the architect of the 5 scrolls. And this is attested to by many present-day Christians. P.N. Benware, a Bible professor and theologian, states that Moses was the human author of Genesis and the other books of the Pentateuch, with the exception of Deuteronomy 34, which records the death of Moses. The Pentateuch, therefore, is an inspired, inerrant, authoritative document written by the man Moses. The authors of the New Commentary on the whole Bible state that the education Moses would have received at the adopted son of Pharaoh specifically qualified him for the task of compiling and writing the Pentateuch. And J.W. Hayford, a Pentecostal minister and Chancellor Emeritus of the King's University, writes, "Jewish tradition lists Moses as the author of Genesis and of the next 4 books. We notice a number of loan words from Egyptian that are found in Genesis, a fact which suggests that the original author had his roots in Egypt, as did Moses. If this is the case, then why do we see in the Pentateuch the inconsistencies and the duplications that were pointed out earlier? To understand that, we need to appreciate how the Bible was produced. The Bible we have today was not so much written as it was compiled over time. The last book, the Revelations of John, was written late in the 1st century A.D., probably about year 95. But it wasn't formally added to the Bible until the 4th century. This was when a series of synods, most notably the Synod of Hippo in 393 A.D., produced the lists of texts we know as the Old and the New Testament. But the Pentateuch is, of course, much older. This chart shows 24 centuries of biblical time, during which the books of the Bible were written and assembled. The New Testament was written in the 1st century A.D., and the Old and New Testaments were confirmed in the 4th century A.D. Moses would have written his books 1,400 years earlier in the 13th century B.C., at about the time he was leading his people out of Egypt, and over 200 years before the tribes were separated into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, and then exiled into Babylon. Whether Moses wrote them all or dictated some of them to his scribes, the books would have been written on scrolls. Now, what do you suppose would be the shelf life of a scroll? In Moses' time, scrolls would have been made of parchment, a thin material made from calf skin, sheepskin, or goat skin. Parchment is distinct from leather in that it is limed but not tanned. Therefore, it is very reactive to changes in relative humidity and is not waterproof. Even though the scrolls would probably have been protected in leather or earthen jars when not in use, eventually they would deteriorate and need to be copied. And there would have been multiple copies of the scrolls. In one respect, the proponent of the documentary hypothesis may be right. It is possible that there were scribes like G, E, P, and D at the times that they suggest, but they didn't have to be independent authors. They could have been scribes, assigned to copy the scrolls for Israel in the north, Judah in the south, the priestly tribe of the Levites, and the reunified church following the return of the Jews from Babylon. Then there is the issue of language. If Moses had written these books at about 1300 BC, they would have been written in Sinaitic, Canaanite, or North Semitic scripts. These originals would have to have been transliterated into Paleo-Hebrew during the time of the divided kingdom. Transliterate simply means to spell in the characters of another alphabet. It's like translating, but it is a more complex and time-consuming process. Then this Paleo-Hebrew version would have been transliterated again into Old Aramaic script during the exile. During these projects of transliteration, scribes would very likely have updated some material, such as place names that would have changed to help the reader understand. Of course, that's not the end of the language trail. The books were translated into Standard Hebrew before they were incorporated into the Talmud in the 4th century BC. And in the 3rd century BC, Ptolemy II commissioned a translation of the entire Old Testament into Greek, a version known as the Septuagint. Then eventually the church in Rome produced a Bible in Latin in the 4th century AD, translated from the Greek and Hebrew texts. This version, which included both Old and New Testaments, was called the Vulgate. It served the church for 1,000 years until the time of the Reformation, when it was translated into modern languages. So there were many hands at work over many centuries preserving the books of Moses and the later books of the Old and the New Testaments. Now let's go back to where we started, to the evidence cited in the documentary hypothesis. With what we have learned, can we address these issues with Moses as the author of the Pentateuch? I think we can. With respect to anachronisms, the NIV has already acknowledged that some later editing was done to Moses' work in order to make it more understandable to the reader. But that does not exclude Moses as the author. The most significant issue here is the description of Moses' death, and this too can be explained. The Lord had told Moses that he would not live to see the promised land, and Moses' people would not want to leave this issue hanging for subsequent generations. A loyal servant and scribe like Joshua would have written the epitaph at the very end of Deuteronomy to give us closure. So check that one off. Next, we have the issue of point of view. Unfortunately, we do not have the scrolls that Moses wrote. We have translations of copies that were transliterated from ancient scripts, all accomplished over the period of 1,000 years. If Moses wrote on the original scroll, and God said to me, somewhere along the line a scribe charged with copying the text would have noted that this should be read, and God said to me, meaning Moses. This would eventually be translated simply as God said to Moses. So writing that started out as the speaker talking about himself ends up looking like the writing of an observer. Check that one off. The issue of style can also be explained by the series of scribes and translators, but it's possible that Moses himself contributed to this. In most of the books, Moses is writing to the people, But in the case of Leviticus, he is writing to the priests of the tribe of Levi, dealing primarily with issues of the law. In this case, Moses might well have employed a more formal writing style than used in the other books. And this brings us to doublets. Sometime prior to the 4th century BC, someone or some group pulled together the text that had been used by the various groups in Israel, in Judah, and those exiled in Babylon, and edited them into the Pentateuch as we know it today. And in the process, they sometimes included slightly different descriptions of the same events. And I, for one, am glad that they did. Just like the multiple stories of Jesus told by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Gospels, they give us a much richer story than we would have had otherwise. No one questions the multiple stories of Jesus in the Gospels. Why should we question the doublets that appear in the Pentateuch? Now I think that we can answer the question that I posed at the very beginning. Who wrote the books of Moses? The answer seems pretty clear to me. Moses wrote the books of Moses. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for your sacred word and for the many servants who captured it and preserved it for hundreds of generations. We thank you for the message that it brings, with wisdom and instructions that are just as appropriate for us today as they were for the people in Moses' time. Help us to apply that wisdom and follow those instructions in everything that we do and say. And help us to share your message with the world. We ask this in your name and for your sake. Amen.